faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones.
Well, good morning, y'all, and thanks for coming for another week in the Hall of Faith. If you're joining us for the first time today, or maybe have been in and out the last month, we have been journeying through Hebrews 11, which is called the Hall of Faith. It's kind of this really compact part of Scripture that talks about some of the heroes of this faith that we observe and why. And so today, we're going to rewind all the way back to before the Israelites inhabited the land of Egypt, all the way back to Genesis, which is one of my favorite books ever, and explore the life of a man that you may have heard of before, a man named Joseph. So our story today begins, as many fantastic stories throughout history have begun. It begins with a dream. And I don't know about you, but I've had some pretty crazy dreams in my 33 years of life. Those that know me well know that I'm actually an infamous sleepwalker, okay? And so I have kept my family on their toes for many years, especially when I lived at home. And now, my husband's probably saying amen to this, but especially when I am tired or stressed or anything. But when I was a kid, I would sleepwalk and talk a lot more. And we had this neighbor when I was little. I was probably like 11 years old, and he was a wrestler, okay? He was probably 12, like a year older than me. And I had this big crush on our neighbor. His name was Cody, okay? And of course, everybody could kind of tell that I did, and my family would heckle me about this, but I would deny it, right? As 11-year-olds do with their first crush. I denied it to the ends of the earth. I did not have a crush on Cody. And so we were actually on a family trip headed to Florida. My dad loved to drive all night. This was his thing. And so I was sleeping in the car, and we were kind of stuck in a traffic jam. So everyone else had woken up, but I was still asleep, apparently. I've heard this story recounted to me many times. And apparently, as we're sitting in this traffic jam and I'm the only one asleep, my sister's in the back, I say out loud in my sleep, "Catch your own ride, Brenna," who's my sister. "Cody's taking me home." And I have no recollection of this, as I never do when I sleep talk, but when I woke up the next morning, everybody could not wait to tell me that their suspicions had been confirmed and I had been outed. I had a crush on neighbor Cody. But today we're going to talk about a dream that has a little bit more significance. And so if you want to turn in your Bibles or your attention to the screen overhead to Genesis chapter 37, we are going to read verses 1 through 11. And like I said before, it's centering around a youngest son named Joseph. And we're going to hear about Joseph's dream. So Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with many sleeves, or as many say, the coat of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all the other brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There were binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly, my sheaf rose up and stood upright, and then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So Joseph's story begins from the very outset with these two powerful dreams. Dreams that speak of a future full of importance, full of power, full of hidden promise. But a lot stands between Joseph and the fulfillment of these visions. These visions that we find out later were given to him by God. Just like many of us, Joseph began his life with big dreams, but he lived in the real world. And for many years, life threatened to stand in the way of these dreams becoming a reality. And so let's take a look at this video to catch a little bit more of Joseph's story as it unfolds in Genesis.
Jacob had 12 sons, but his favorite was Joseph. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were working in the fields. Joseph's brothers resented him, and when they saw him coming, they attacked him and threw him in a well. Then they sold their brother as a slave, took off his coat, soaked it in goat's blood, and showed it to their father, tricking him into believing a wild animal had killed Joseph. Soon after, Joseph was sold to a military official in Egypt as a servant. God helped Joseph do great work, and the official was very happy with him. Joseph was very handsome, and the official's wife tried day after day to seduce him. One day, she pressured Joseph so much that he ran out of the house, leaving his coat behind. She told everyone that he tried to force himself on her. The official was furious and threw Joseph in jail. God once again helped Joseph in all he did. And eventually he was put in charge of all the prisoners, helping run the jail. Joseph had the special ability to interpret people's dreams. One day, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, asked Joseph to interpret one of his dreams. He dreamed that 7 fat cows were eaten by 7 skinny cows, and 7 heads of healthy grain were eaten up by 7 heads of dried up grain. God helped Joseph interpret the dream. Egypt would experience 7 years of successful farming, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh was impressed and put Joseph second in charge of Egypt. During the famine, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt looking for food. When they got there, they met with Joseph, but didn't recognize him right away. When Joseph finally told them who he was, they wept because they were sorry for what they had done. Eventually, they went and got their father Jacob and brought him back to Egypt. Joseph took care of his entire family, giving them property in the best part of the land where they lived for the rest of their lives.
We got a little beat there at the end. I love it. So that's the story of Joseph. It's a pretty epic tale. And I'm wondering, just from the very beginning of this story, how many of us aren't already relating with our friend Joseph? Did you ever have a great big dream when you were younger? Anyone in here want to become president before you knew how rough of a job that was, right? Anybody have a dream of curing cancer or being an astronaut, a mountain climber, or a ballerina? I know growing up in Oklahoma, there was some boys in here that wanted to be professional football players or maybe a basketball star. There's something about youthfulness that encourages dreaming, outrageous dreaming, illogical dreaming that allows you to look right at the world in all its brokenness and still believe that anything is possible. And really, that's exactly what we see Joseph doing here. You know, we talked before that Joseph was a youngest son. And in biblical times, to be a youngest son meant that you didn't have much of a future spread out before you. The oldest son got all of the inheritance. They got to kind of dictate everything that everyone in the family did, and you worked for the oldest son. He is one of the youngest in his family, and his job is to take his brother's lunch and run messages back and forth between his family members. He is expected by everyone around him to amount to nothing more. However, Joseph persists in dreaming. And what it ends up doing is making everyone really mad. He comes across a little bit cocky and arrogant. He goes to his brothers and he says, well, I had a dream that you'll all bow down to me. He goes to his father and says, I shall rule over everyone. And this doesn't come across well. As we saw in the video, Joseph's brothers so oppose his belief that he can rise above him in the world that they fake his death and sell him into slavery. Scripture tells us just before they commit this act of violence against their brother that this is what they said. They saw Joseph from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say, 'A wild animal has devoured him,' and we shall see what becomes of his dreams." Before Joseph's dreams can even start to take shape, those closest to him tell him the future he sees for himself will never be a possibility. And I'm wondering if most of us haven't had a similar experience. It's true, most of us haven't been thrown into the bottom of a pit and sold into Egyptian slavery, but I think almost all of us have had someone in our lives tell us that we're not enough, that we're not capable enough, brave enough, rich enough, accomplished enough to do the things that we've dreamed for ourselves, much less the things that God has placed in our hearts. And Joseph had every reason, bound as a prisoner on the way to Egypt, to believe that his dreams, God's dreams for him, were over, and that had died in that well his brothers threw him in. But lucky for Joseph's family and the entire population of Egypt, Joseph continued dreaming. But as we saw earlier, the Lord was with Joseph, and things start to go much better for him than when he was in the bottom of the well. He's sold into slavery, but as a slave, he has it pretty good. He's sold to a rich official that's in Pharaoh's service, and Joseph actually starts running a household. He's in charge of things. He has autonomy. He has a lot of freedom for someone that's in captive. And Potiphar's wife starts to take notice of Joseph. And here we have a woman that's willing to give Joseph physical pleasure with no strings attached, and no one would have known. Women caught in acts of adultery during that time, it was punishable by death. So this woman had every instinct, she had every motivation to keep this a secret. Here Joseph is in slavery, and he could have lived his life in relative wealth and comfort with a side benefit of female companionship. He could have been satisfied. After all, for a younger brother who was thrown in the well and ends up in slavery, Joseph had done pretty well for himself. Didn't he deserve a little pleasure? Didn't he deserve some comfort? But Joseph, assured that God had greater plans for him, refused to be tempted by comfort and wealth or physical gratification. Scripture says in Genesis 39, now Joseph was handsome and good looking, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on him. "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. I love the language used in this text. It says Joseph didn't just resist and refuse this temptation, but he ran, he fled. This is easier said than done, though, because at some point or another, we will all be tempted to leave behind the dreams God has for us, to pursue desires born out of our own selfishness. I know I have. Here's kind of a story about me is when I was in high school, I had already begun to sense that I was called into full-time ministry, that this might be God's plan for my life. But I was really confused because I had a good GPA and I had some scholarship opportunities, and everyone around me kind of told me, like, you need to get a real job, Bethany, right? They said, I kind of wanted to go to school to be a pastor, but they said, you can always do that later. You can always volunteer in the church. What you need is to create financial stability for yourself and your family. What you need is a prestigious career path. You don't want to waste these scholarships to this business college on something you're not sure about. And so honestly, I was fearful. I was fearful about being a female pastor in the world. I was fearful about a future that lacked security and stability. I was fearful because I wasn't 100% sure. And so I actually did go for 1 year to business school, and I kind of ran from this dream that I knew God had put in my heart because I wanted to find something more secure for myself. Luckily, it only took a year for all those fears to be dispelled, because there's nothing scarier for someone that should be a ministry major than having to take economics and calculus in the same semester. So here I am. But temptations come in all shapes and sizes, don't they? Maybe we're tempted to lay aside the value we know we have in Christ to pursue temporary pleasures. Maybe we're tempted by wealth and power to overlook the needs of the weak and the poor, to get more for ourselves at all cost. Maybe we're willing to give up doing the meaningful thing with our lives because we're too busy building our own kingdoms. But no matter what it is, we all know it's very often difficult to look temptation and the things we want in the face and flee. But Joseph did, and it's because he understood something that is also true for every one of us, that God had an important destiny for him. Joseph understood the important plans God has for his future, and they shouldn't be squandered on lust or laziness or pride. Joseph was able to understand that God's future for him far outweighed the opportunities for instant gratification around him. And Joseph continued to run towards the future that God had for him with everything he had. Even in the midst of temptation, I'm getting ahead of myself. Joseph continued to dream the dreams of God. And I hope we're faithful enough to do the same. So, unfortunately, things get worse before they get better for our relentless dreamer. Potiphar's wife, scorned by rejection, falsely accused Joseph of assault, and it landed him in prison. Joseph discovers his God-given ability to interpret dreams, and he interprets the dream of a servant of Pharaoh who had been imprisoned as well. This servant is released from prison, and Joseph begs this person, remember me when you get to Pharaoh so that I can be released from bondage. Pharaoh's servant, however, forgets about Joseph, and Joseph remains in prison for 2 entire years. I'm sure there were moments as Joseph sat in prison and the worst possible situation, with seemingly no way out, that he began to doubt his God-given destiny. And who wouldn't? Because as many of us have experienced, there's truly nothing that threatens our dreams more than when tragedy quickly strikes. So when I was a junior in college, I was interning at a church, and we had this dynamic team of pastors who got this vision, and we decided, and the church decided that we were going to plant a church out of the church that we were attending. And so it was just this little baby dream at first, but we launched a second service, and we started kind of building this core group of people who were going to launch this church with us in this community. We gave hours and time at coffee shops planning how we would lead and pastor, and the district and senior leadership in the church caught this vision with us. They sent us to be trained to plant this church and started getting a timeline ready for us. We were talking finances and budget. This was actually going to happen. And then, because of no fault of anyone's own, it all kind of fell apart. The parent church that we were going to plant out of, the pastor went through a difficult season, and people lost the vision. The funding wouldn't quite go through. Everything floundered in the 11th hour. And honestly, it was devastating. I remember sitting in the office of my religion professor and just sobbing. You know what it felt like? It felt like the death of a dream. If you'll fast forward 7 years later, I had just come on the team at Life Church right here in Owasso. And Cortland and I were super excited because we heard that they were going to be planting a church, a brand new community for the first time in Kansas City. We had never really been to Overland Park, but the idea of this church plant, of hearing it reignited this thing inside of us. Honestly, it reignited this dream that we'd had to plant a church. And we couldn't explain it, but we felt like God was calling us to go. It was a huge long shot because nobody knew who I was, and I had just gotten there, but I threw my name in the hat, and I know that it was God's will because I actually landed a spot on the launch team. We were Kansas City bound in a matter of months. A couple weeks later, we found out some more great news that we were expecting our first baby. This made the decision a little bit harder, right? I'm an Oklahoma girl, and were we really going to leave town to go to a new place right as we were expecting our first child? I know my family had a few things to say about that, right? But we really felt like God was calling us to go. And so the week before the moving trucks pulled up to move us to Kansas City, we had an ultrasound. And it was that really important ultrasound, the one where you find out if it's a boy or a girl, and they check everything out to make sure everything looks right for your baby. Cortland couldn't be there that day. He had already started his job in Kansas City, where a new life was about to begin. And so my parents were there with me that day when we went in for the ultrasound. And you know those times where you immediately know something's amiss? The ultrasound tech could barely muster a grin when she said, "It's a girl." We waited for the doctor to come in, and there was a stiffness in his mannerisms where we knew that something was off. The doctor asked us to go back into a back room, and we kind of went back there just following blindly, not sure what was in store. And it was on that day that I found out a lot about a super rare, sinister genetic illness called arthrogryposis. I found out that my baby could grow and live inside my womb for a matter of a few more months, but that she would never have any kind of meaningful life outside in the world. And reality was, her heart could stop at any time. I'll remember that day forever for a lot of reasons, but largely because I had to dial my husband's number and wait for him to pick up and tell him to get on a plane home because our baby wasn't going to make it. We had a lot of decisions to make over the next few days, and one of them was certainly this. Were we still moving to Kansas City? We knew we were about to walk through perhaps the most difficult thing we'd ever face. Were we still to leave behind everything familiar and walk into a new place with people we barely knew and bring together a church in a city that we'd never been to? As we grieved and raged and sobbed and prayed and sought God together over the next couple days, something became so clear to us. We couldn't leave this dream behind that we felt God had placed in our hearts because we were afraid, or because we were sad, or because the whole world felt like it was falling down around us. In a way that can only be explained as supernatural, we knew that the dream God had for this church in Kansas was going to be something beautiful that pulled us through the nightmare that laid ahead. And so we did it. We packed up the truck and moved to Kansas City, and we vowed to spend every day sitting in gratefulness for any time we had left with the sweet girl growing inside us. We named our baby girl early. Maggie June was her nickname. Magnolia June was her whole name. And we shared her story with so many people in the coming days. I was a pastor at a brand new church, and people wanted to know what was going on. They could tell I was pregnant, and I had to tell the story over and over of how we were about to lose this little blessing inside me at any moment. At first, I was reluctant to share with strangers the intense grief that I felt, but truly something crazy started happening. As I opened up to newcomers of this brand new church, their hearts flew open towards us. The staff that I was working with that were strangers before became family to us as we brought new life into the city through a church and held on to every moment of life we had with the baby girl that I was carrying. That kind of love and care and sacrifice, our little girl became such a part of it. I prayed, though no time was promised, that she would make it to the day that we got to launch the church on Easter Sunday. I wanted to share that day with my baby girl, with her heart still beating. So that became my hope. And that prayer was answered as it turned out. We launched Life Church Overland Park on March 31st, 2016. And Maggie June, the precious baby who made us parents, was still born on April 9th. Just 9 days later, after the church we worked so hard to plant came into existence. The days after were hard to process. We'd experienced this dream come true. A beautiful new community where God could move and work wonders in the coming years. And we'd experienced a loss, one that would scar us and wound us forever. But in ways that can't be separated from one another, our little girl was a part of the birth of not just a church, but the beginning of a miraculous family for us. And she's still there on that campus today in the form of a little tree they planted in her honor. It's a magnolia tree, right outside for her namesake, Magnolia June. It's right outside the kids' ministry doors. Looking back, I'm so glad we didn't say no to the dream in our hearts. I'm so glad Cortland, Maggie, and I got to be a part of that incredible journey together. I'll admit it was hard to keep dreaming for a while in the wake of intense grief. But it's in those dark days that we're called to fiercely place our hope in God, the author of our dreams, the one who makes all things work together for good. It's these kind of dark days that Joseph sat in that prison cell and held tightly to faith to pull him toward the future that lay ahead, even though he didn't know how it would work out. In the midst of unexplainable and undeserved hardship, Joseph does not stop dreaming. And I hope we're brave enough to do the same. Well, after 2 daunting years in prison, things begin to change for Joseph. Pharaoh had been having this relentless dream over and over about these skinny cows that came up out of the water and ate these really chubby cows. And it was really bothering him having it night overnight. And then he had other dreams about this grain stalk that was plump and ready to harvest being eaten by these gaunt and withered ones. And would you know it, that the man who forgot Joseph all those years in the cell, it finally comes to him, wait, I know a guy. He's been rotting in prison for 2 years. Maybe we should call him up. And so Joseph gets to appear before Pharaoh, and God showed Joseph the meaning of these dreams. A horrible famine would wreak havoc on the land in Egypt in the upcoming years. There would be 7 years of plenty first, and then Egypt would experience a famine unlike any country had known or experienced before. This would throw the whole population into disorder, starvation, and chaos, unless someone stepped in to save them. The text says that Joseph was only 30 years old when Pharaoh appointed him second in command of all of Egypt as the man who would save their nation from death and desolation. And I love this so much because it's here that God's dreams for Joseph finally become clear. All those years ago, Joseph thought that his dreams meant he would be this great ruler and he would make people bow before him. He used it to taunt his brothers. He used it to make him feel like he had a place in this world as a youngest son. But God gave Joseph such great power and authority because he needed someone not to be a great and mighty ruler, but because he needed someone to save millions of people from tragedy. Here, Joseph glimpses what it means to dream the dreams of God. That God's dreams are not about status. They aren't about gaining wealth or money or power or influence just for the sake of it. The dream God gave Joseph was a dream that had a specific purpose, to look beyond himself and to serve the people of Egypt when they needed it the most. You see, when God's dream for Joseph finally came to pass, it was obvious that God had been preparing Joseph his entire life, not to simply become a mighty ruler, but to become a man whose life was defined by a commitment to helping others, to reaching beyond himself. Joseph didn't just dream the dreams of the world, he dreamed the dreams of God. And because of his faithfulness, an entire nation was saved from famine and destruction. So I think we can all agree this is a truly epic tale. It takes up like 12 chapters in Genesis because it is a saga unlike any other. There's a lot of things to learn from Joseph's story, but one question I want us to ask today is, what kind of dreams are we dreaming? I think for some of us, the answer is we've stopped dreaming altogether. I know that I've been there after a lot of heartache and tragedy in my life. We can live life in survival mode, taking it one day at a time, trying to get through the struggle, paycheck to paycheck, one foot in front of the other. We think dreams are something for our children or for those who don't have our responsibilities or our issues or our history. Truthfully, I think many of us have stopped dreaming because the events of our lives have told us that dreams really don't come true. For some of us, we have lots of dreams, right? Dreams for our careers, dreams for our children, dreams for what we'll achieve and conquer, for the next big thing that we can accomplish. And these kinds of dreams are good. But if there's anything that we can learn from the story of Joseph, it's that God's dreams sometimes look different than ours. God's dreams involve us reaching out to the poor, the outcast, for Joseph, for the actual starving, for the marginalized, reaching out to those who can't help themselves and bringing them into God's future and God's hope. When I think of great dreamers, there's a couple people that come to mind immediately along with our hero for today. And one of them is Martin Luther King. We all know he had a dream, right? A dream for equality for African Americans and for the people of the world to finally be able to look past the color of our skin and stand side by side in love and unity. Here's another one. Anybody know her? Mother Teresa, a humble nun and school teacher of many years, had a dream very late in life that those who lived in destitution and poverty on the streets of Calcutta, homeless and dying, could at least be given a dignified place to end their life, a place where they would be cared for and held close and shown the love of their Creator during their last moments. There isn't a single person in this room Who hasn't heard of these two people, that hasn't been inspired by their ability to look at a world that is broken and still dream the dreams of God? And I most certainly think that that's the call of God for all of us today. If you're someone who gave up dreaming a long time ago, gave up thinking anything new or creational or important could ever happen in your life, the story of Joseph is for you. It's the story of a youngest son, an Israelite boy with no future, a slave and a prisoner, whose family was anything but supportive, who through following the dreams of God saved a nation from starvation. If God dreamed through Joseph, he certainly wants to dream through you. If you're someone who's accustomed to dreaming, if you look at the world and it's your oyster and you see endless possibilities, the story of Joseph is for you too. The story of Joseph begs us to not give in to the temptation to make our dreams all about ourselves, but to let God transform them into dreams for our world, for God's world. Dreams that usher in the very kingdom of heaven itself. It's truly the prayer of my heart that no matter where each of us find ourselves this morning, that we would let God dream a dream inside of us. That he would fill each of us with a passion and hope for a future and a confidence that he can use us, just as he did Joseph, to advance his love and mercy in a world where famine is still truly all around us. So this week, we've been doing weekly exercises. And so I wanted to just think together about how we can be shaped by this story of Joseph. And the first thing I think we can do is a dream inventory, okay? So this might sound kind of weird, but think to yourself. Find some time this week. Maybe in your quiet time with God, maybe when you're, just daydreaming. Think to yourself, what dreams do I have? Do I have any? What's the content of my dreams? Is it all about me? Is it something about a passion where God could use it to impact others? Or is it time to ask God to give you a fresh vision for bringing his kingdom, his peace in the world around you? I believe he'll do that. If you don't have a dream, ask God for a dream. He's a God that's got something to give you that can bless the world, where your great passion and the world's deep hunger meet. And the last one is if you find yourself with a dream for God, a dream for this world, you're looking out and you're seeing a need and you want to be a part of it, keep dreaming. Talk to someone about it. Talk to someone who might join you in the vision of bringing out God's dream for the world in reality. And so today, I just want to send you out with a benediction about dreaming, and I hope that we can dream together this week. Go out into the world and labor to bring forth new lives of humility, peace, and grace. Dream dreams, pursue visions, and speak of God's goodness and generosity in the world, in the words of those who would hear. And may our God, who breathed life into creation and into your heart, be your great delight. I love you guys so much. Dream big this week. You're the best.